Our conversation this morning is probably the single most important conversation we can have about America qua America. You could talk about climate change, but that's everyone. This, I think, is an American story that needs talking about and framing in a way that hasn't happened yet. And to do that, we have Zoe Baird, the president of the Markle Foundation, and Mike Levitt, the former governor of Utah, former head of the HHS and the EPA. And we're going to talk about some of their ideas and initiatives for figuring out how what looks to be the end of the American dream, the sense of despair and hopelessness sometimes about whether or not an American middle class can thrive as it did in our lifetimes and our parents' lifetimes. Before we start that conversation, we want to show a great video, several minutes, produced by the Markle Foundation. Here it goes.
The last few years in America, we certainly have seen a fracturing of what I would loosely describe as the American dream or the American promise. And what I mean by that specifically is that there's no doubt that the inequality within the country has created a situation where many, many Americans are being left behind. And the question, I think, for all of us is, should we accept that, or should we try and do something about it?
People are much more reluctant to say the country's on the right track. They're much more reluctant to say, I think that my children are going to have a better standard of living than I have. And so the damage of the financial crisis and some broader global economic pressures, I think, underlie this anxiety that's present in America. Can I find a job, and is it going to be at a decent wage that rises over time so I can take care of myself and my children, parents, and those different dimensions of the American dream?
Everything is moving at warp speed, and that often people feel kind of bowled over by both globalization and technology. And if we don't understand that it is a genuine challenge and that we can't just be victims of either globalization or technology, but the masters of it, the sooner we learn that, the better.
We have to fundamentally rethink our economic system, because the pace at which this innovation is taking place, the pace at which creative destruction is going to continue, is breathtaking.
It's a race to figure out if we can use technology to produce some net positive outcomes, as opposed to technology only producing this labor replacement outcome where we have so much economic disruption as a function of that.
One critical component to reigniting the American dream is, I think, imagination.
Where we are located now, it used to be an old liquor store, so we changed that view of the community, bringing a new technology, a disruptive technology into the fold. I believe it's necessary for the middle class to develop new skills the same way we needed to learn how to interface with computers on a daily basis, and then how we needed to implement the internet and World Wide Web access.
We need to stop thinking that education starts at a particular time or ends at a particular time. We have to believe that there actually is the lifelong opportunity to learn. We also then need to ask ourselves, how do we actually teach to the person instead of teaching to the curriculum?
More than you would have ever imagined, there are new ways to facilitate learning. We now have the ability to move back and forth in real time. We have the ability to engage in learning with unbelievable technological capabilities. And so online learning now is a powerful tool that didn't exist even 5 years ago.
One of the things that globalization and technology have created for small and medium-sized businesses is the opportunity to participate and sell to customers anywhere in the world, to be able to access suppliers anywhere in the world quite directly, something which is completely unheard of for most small and medium-sized businesses 20, 30 years ago.
When it comes to innovation, true value lies at the intersection of multiple data sets. We don't have to look far, but to two public policy decisions that changed the course of history. One was democratizing data around the Human Genome Project that gave rise to massive innovation around personalized medicine. The second was something as simple as GPS data, what we take for granted.
The real question is, what should be the model for how we learn, how we live, and how we work? And we need inspired leadership to help us step through and ask those questions and really work hard at the solutions.
There are significant challenges and issues in our country that we have to address. And it's not only the responsibility of Washington to do it, it's also the responsibility of business and business leaders to do everything we can to support our people and the communities we serve.
In order to restore the American dream, in order to bring back hope and promise for so many young people in this nation, we need strong, visionary leadership. That leadership has to be more than just strong and visionary in the sense of rhetoric. It has to be ready to take risks.
So the Markle Foundation is trying to frame this, figure out a way to insert this into the discourse, start the conversation and going. The two basic things you look at as technology and globalization that are our enemies, or the enemies of the middle class who feels as though they no longer have the bright future. It seems, not to oversimplify, but that those very things, correctly harnessed, can be the salvation as well. Is that basically where you're going with this initiative?
Well, as you saw from the video, and that was really an intention intended to bring into the room so many other people who could be up here and talking about the same thing, and to have you see the passion and commitment and concern that those people and so many others have about this issue, and to hope that you will yourselves perceive yourself as part of this quest. But our view is that globalization and technology have been hitting this country hard as a tsunami hits, and that rising tide has not been lifting all boats. That's the old adage, the rising tide will lift all boats. Well, it's not happening with the forces of globalization and technology hitting this country. And we believe that the waves to come are going to hit harder and faster and with more and more power. And to date, that has been washing away jobs for most middle-class Americans and even their homes in many cases. And what we believe is that we have to prepare for this future, and that we need to take the very forces that have been causing this destruction of the middle class and use those to rebuild the middle class. And we all feel that it's unacceptable in this country to have an economy that's built without a strong, vibrant middle class and the opportunity for participation by anyone in the country who wants to work hard and live up to the old American dream. But right now, that really isn't possible. And so we see some big bets in globalization and technology that we think can turn around the impact that they're having, and in fact cause them to be forces that enable so many Americans, millions of Americans, to participate in what can be a very exciting future. And just in brief, those big bets that we see, which were alluded to in the video, are using technology for new ways of learning and preparing for jobs. So things like the Starbucks Arizona State University announcement recently that they were going to provide the possibility of going to college online for Starbucks employees, getting access to a great research university, but at home when you had to work and you still wanted to complete your college degree, and making that affordable. So that's, one example of the kind of learning that we see using technology tools. And we also see great opportunities to scale business activity by meeting the needs of the middle class all over the world, as middle classes are growing in China and Brazil and in countries all over the world, and to use technology to get our services as well as our goods into those countries and into those markets, and in addition, as was alluded to in the film, using big data so that small businesses don't have to any longer have the investment in infrastructure that big businesses had, but they can use technology tools to do a lot of the same things.
I entirely understand how entrepreneurs like the fellow we saw who has his 3D printing shop in Washington Heights can benefit from this, how small businesses can learn how to be exporters in a part of the global market. But what about when we talk about the large middle class, from the people who had, the hundreds of thousands of people who thought they had a sure thing with a job in Detroit in the auto industry, or these vast groups of people who, some of whom surely will thrive and figure out a way in this new environment, but what is to be done about not just the lost manufacturing jobs, but the jobs across the board that are no longer there and probably aren't coming back?
Well, I think the message of this initiative is that the American dream is alive, very much alive, that the principles that have produced prosperity for this country will continue to produce prosperity. We just have to transition well from one era to the other. And we have transitioned well in previous eras, and there's worry now that we're not transitioning as fundamentally, in such a fundamentally sound way. And we're looking for the ways in which we can ignite a better transition. The factory worker, the principles are still there. Hard work still pays off. Honesty is still important. Initiative and innovation are still important. We just have to find the ways of fueling that.
And how much, we've talked about this great Starbucks, Howard Schultz ASU project, in which you were involved, happening as it's one great example. And obviously there are other would-be Howard Schultzes around who can see this and do what they can in their businesses to make it happen. How much of it is also, does it require political change, regulatory change, new ways of thinking and talking about the future? Since it seems to me the 20th century vocabulary is not suitable to whatever it is we have to create going forward.
Well, we've talked about education a lot. Howard's done a wonderful thing in initiating this thing at Starbucks. Zoe and I have talked about a project that is dear to me. Some years ago, I was governor. There were a bunch of us who were looking at the business model of higher education and saying, as we transition into this new era where people are going to have to be re-educated over and over and over again, we simply cannot provide the opportunity unless we re-examine the model. And rather than just think about delivering education using technology, maybe we ought to challenge how we measure progress. And so we initiated a new kind of institution called Western Governors University. There were 19 states. Two things that were unique about it. The first was that we would measure student progress not by how much time they spend in their seat, but we would measure by their ability to demonstrate competency. Now roll forward 15 years later, and I guess the second part was we were going to deliver it all over the internet. That institution has 50,000 students. Last week they were judged to be the #1 educator of teachers out of 1,600 universities. It's the largest math and science teacher, a source of training math and science teachers. The average education, the average tuition hasn't gone up for 6 years, and it is about $6,000 a year, about a third of a normal state university. Mm-hmm. My point is, in order to transition, we didn't just say, look, let's deliver education online. Let's not just apply technology. Let's change the model. Let's challenge the model and begin to find ways of delivering education to people who otherwise couldn't get it in a way that is not just less expensive, but is actually providing higher quality. And that's the kind of thinking I believe that will ultimately begin to spark us or help us transition in the way that we have to.
And Kurt, one of the things I'd add to that is how many people in this room have heard of Western Governors University? Well, that's impressive, actually. I thought there'd be no hands going up, but then Jim Fallows has followed every development. One of the things that I think is really important about all this is that we need to change our model of what we value and what we honor so that someone who gets a teaching credential at Western Governors University, those of you who've gone to the education panels, have heard over and over and over again, we need to change the way we teach. John Daisy said at an education panel the other day, we ought to throw out all the ed schools and start over. Well, Western Governors University did that, and they were ranked the #1 institution training teachers. And yet few of us have heard of it, and probably fewer of us would give it equal respect with a Harvard Ed School. And I think this is part of what is happening. The way we think of Uber as great an institution now, as we think of taxi, the yellow cab, or the way we think of Airbnb as an interesting, I mean, the excitement around that panel yesterday was palpable, and yet it's people renting out rooms in their homes, you know, compared to Hilton. We never would have respected that 2 or 3 years ago until we saw it happening. So I think a key part of this is for us to respect these new ways of doing things and to get the existing institutions, the MITs creating micro diplomas for people in fields who can't go to MIT for 4 years, and you know, transforming edX out of the Harvard MIT model into something that's much more inclusive and open to many, many more participants. But I think part of it has got to be ourselves and our willingness to learn about these new ways of doing things in the same way we do with consumer products or consumer services that we get excited about. We need to get excited about these new ways of educating people and honoring and understanding the education that they get.
If can I put a finer point on that? I think the lesson to be learned on the transition into this global economy, I think Tom Friedman, when he wrote The World is Flat, he basically made the point that it was competency, ultimately, that was going to be rewarded in a global economy. And the education system has not necessarily measured for that. We have measured lots of other things, but we have not measured straightforward competency, and no matter where it came from. And so when you ask, does government have to get involved? Forget about the fact that we were talking about education. What's changed here is that we changed what we rewarded. We changed what was rewarded. And I think a big part of what has to occur in transitioning an economy is beginning to recognize that government does need to change what it rewards, that institutions need to change what we reward. We need to, because we're now dealing in a world that is global, and where someone can provide something better for us at a fingers, with a click, and no longer are we protected by borders or by boundaries or by artificial protections.
And when you talk about we need to change what is rewarded, and that can go, I think, across all of these realms we're talking about, and we're talking about inequality and its growth, and how that is not, apart from altruism or morality, is not sustainable for an economy, a thriving economy.
Or a democracy.
Or a democracy. So is, for instance, the fact that the ratio of CEOs' compensation to average workers has gone up so tremendously over the last 20 years, is that part of an example of the problem we're talking about, that what we're rewarding is being a CEO as opposed to just being a hard worker?
Well, you know, there was an interesting article written recently which shows our willingness to rethink our assumptions about what we already respect. So the article was that CEO pay has gone up because technology has enabled CEOs to be engaged much more broadly and deeply with their businesses, and so the job is much harder, and also they're more accountable for more. And I read that article as, you know, we already respect CEOs, so we're looking for how technology is furthering that respect. And what we're trying to do is to say, let's respect Americans. Americans have tremendous talent. You know, you called Americans the amateur nation in a book you wrote years ago. I mean, we have tremendous talents. So let's respect Americans, and let's honor, energize, scale up the kinds of tools that enable Americans to achieve, each of us, our full potential. And we see in learning tools, and in tools that enable us to sell our services anywhere in the world where there's a need for them. Tremendous opportunity, but we're not focused on that. We're all focused on this story of, you know, jobs going overseas, automation taking away jobs. We love the robots taking away jobs. Well,
Well, they are.
they are, but you know, Youth Build is now training inner city kids to repair robots when before they were building houses. They're doing both now, but that's exciting. And the prospect for us to have people learn and find new opportunities are really tremendous, but we're not focused on them. So that's really what we're trying to do, is to get people to see those opportunities and to invest in them, and as a country to invest in them, for businesses to invest in them. For example, businesses have tons of suppliers and small businesses that support them, customers, suppliers. It would be very possible for them to create stronger networks for those small businesses to share information. So people to share information on management of their spare parts, or for them to provide 3D printing machines so that the small businesses, as well as the big businesses, can print spare parts on demand instead of having to have them in a storeroom. Inefficient for the small business. The big business doesn't have to do that. They get the 3D printing machine and they print the spare part. So there are a lot of things we can do if we think constructively and collectively about the problem. Learning is one of the greatest opportunities, though. We now have tools that weren't available, as Michael Crow said in the video. We have tools that weren't available 5 years ago. They have a program going in math at Arizona State University where the teaching tools, it's done by a company called Newton and with Pearson, and the teaching tools learn how you learn, which track of answering a math problem enables you to get it more quickly and more deeply, and then feeds you the next questions in the way you learn. Those tools weren't available 5 years ago. They can change people's attitude about whether they're capable of learning if they're given those tools. LA is trying to bring these into the public school system in a big way, but it's a very small fraction of the public K-12 schools that are doing this, or the colleges, universities.
I just want to use a metaphor that I think's been at least useful to me. When I was governor, we lived in a governor's residence, which was provided by the state. It had a very large clock in the front foyer, and it was broken. And I hired a clockmaker to come see if he could fix it. And while he was there, my daughter, who was at the time about 9 years old, was fascinated by the inside of the clock, and he began to show her how it worked. And he said, take your fingers and try to move all those little gears. And she took her little hands and tried to move the gears, and they were, of course, all caught. And he said, now grab the big one. And she took one about the size of a bike sprocket and moved it to the left and then to the right. And he said, what happens to the rest? And she said, well, they all move when you do that. I think what we're looking to identify in this initiative are, what are the big gears that would allow us to move all the small ones? Mm-hmm. Frankly, CEO pay is a small gear.
For sure.
But if you could begin to move the big gear, which might be making available the kinds of tools that Zoe has just enumerated to thousands of people, millions of people, in a way that we couldn't before, suddenly we're going to become transformatively competitive on a global scale, and there will be a lot more CEOs and a lot more workers. So what are the big gears? And I think we would agree that both technology and education and making available on a global basis, those are among the big gears.
And so I see that, technology certainly, and I want to talk a bit more about how optimistic we should feel about technology across the board solving our problems. Education, we've talked about the kind of cultural change in attitudes of what we prize, whether it's the amateur spirit, whether it's hard work itself, rewarding those kinds of things. But I am interested in what is required on either an urban level of a city politically or the level of the whole nation politically, do we need to change our way of talking and thinking about makers and losers and moochers? And what needs to happen either in terms of the political discourse and the way the conversation is framed, or in terms of policy?
Well, I would go back to what I said initially, and that is that I've remained very optimistic about the American dream because I believe the principles that ultimately created the American dream still live and still will allow prosperity. And there are some fairly basic things, and we've already mentioned some of them, which would, and government, frankly, is a reflection of the aggregate of the people. And so we look at government as though it's some entity. We really have to begin to look inside ourselves and say, what are we teaching our children? What are we valuing in our community? What are the things we're rewarding at the ballot box, etc.? So I'm not sure that just looking at government and saying we need government to change this is one of the big wheels. I think one of the big gears, rather. I think the bigger gears are the things that we're driving for as a community. And I think we keep coming back to them. It's education, being able to provide education. Once we have education being driven in a way that reaches the maximum number of people, a lot of the attitudinal things will begin to change. Once we begin to show more people that this is a global market and that we can't just protect ourselves by using government as a means of being able to limit those are all aspects. Zoe, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think, Kurt, that you make a really interesting point that we don't yet have a vocabulary for this, and we've really struggled with that. You know, we've tried to define things in ways that are understandable in the terms we already understand, but we do need to develop a new vocabulary, and that'll probably come from robust dialogue, and the initial thing that is needed in the political environment, as Cheryl Mills said in the video, is for leaders to begin talking about this and to begin focusing on an objective of reigniting America's future and America's opportunity. And most of that discussion is still in old terms. It's still in terms like rising tide will lift all boats if we keep interest rates low and if we deal with fiscal policy. And it's still in old terms. It's still in reforming.
Taxes should be higher or lower.
Right, and reforming education in the ways we've always talked about reforming education. Well, what we're talking about, I mean, again, John Daisy, the LA school district, mostly low-income kids. And he talks about how low-income kids come to school in the fall, and the principal says to him, "What are you doing hanging out in the hallway?" And the kid says, "You know, I was assigned to a chemistry classroom, but here's my chemistry, completion certificate. I don't need that class." "Well, what's this?" "Well, I went to Stanford online last summer, and I got my chemistry degree, or my chemistry course requirement met." And these are low-income inner-city kids taking the initiative themselves. So, we can, as adults, sit back and hope these kids will figure it out for the next generation, and they will probably do that much better by taking responsibility for their communities and themselves than the government is doing for them right now. But if political leaders are smart, they will begin to see this, and they'll begin to put the power of their office and their influence behind it. And I think that it will take some bravery on the part of political leaders to do that too, because for them to say, we have some optimism, we can do this, then they can only translate it to classical terms. In the trade area, for example, we want everybody to just begin using these internet tools to if they're a personal trainer, why just train one person in your living room? Why not train 50 Chinese online? And just do it. Use the platform. Just do it. Don't worry about export-import regulation. Well, the government will be very caught up in the trade talks that are going on now, which are great trade talks, and if they have success, it's great. But that's why people feel government's out of touch, because political leaders are talking about getting a new trade agreement, and other people are talking about what they can just do online. They don't even know who their customer is on eBay. They could already be selling to 100 people in Brazil until they ship it. And fortunately, the shipping is able to be done, and eBay provides the platform that enables them to meet the customs requirements or whatever. So
but then
it's happening.
To the point of exports, imports, we have this, to me, ridiculous seeming conversation about whether we should have the Federal Import-Export Bank, which seems to be an example of the public-private cooperation that we are all looking toward as a way to make this country prosperous. And it has become this kind of red herring issue with a politics so poisonously unable to get beyond those kinds of things. So I say, when I talk about government, I'm not talking necessarily about government, but I'm talking about the politics we have now, which is almost unable to embrace solutions if they involve the government.
Well, that's one of the reasons we need initiatives like this. You know, as Howard Schultz said in the video, we concluded we could not be bystanders. We had to go out and just try to see if we could have some impact and help accelerate the country in a direction that we think will be really constructive. And hopefully we will come up with ideas that everybody will embrace or people will try out, and to the extent that they need the resources of the government behind them, we hope that there'll be enough public demand and interest in them that that'll be able to happen.
I spend a lot of my time in the healthcare world. And of course, if you pick up any newspaper, all you read about is the Affordable Care Act and whether it's being interpreted one way or the other, or what the latest political pushback is on it. Or I have to tell you that as a person who spends most of his time focused on this, government is not having all that much of an impact here. What's driving this is global economic dispassionate forces that are causing employers and purchasers and others to say, we have to get better at this. I have to tell you, I am more optimistic right now about the United States coming up with a uniquely American solution to this than I've been in the last 10 years.
To healthcare.
And it has very little to do with the Affordable Care Act.
Okay.
It has to do with the fact that I am seeing people do very hard things because they have a Darwinian instinct to survive. And what's occurring is that people are becoming less and less persuaded that government is really the answer to this, or that ultimately government is going to produce the solution, and they're beginning to use things like the internet to develop entirely new capacities that are almost outside of government's purview. That's where most of the innovation is coming. Now, I don't mean this to sound as though, I don't want this to sound so libertarian or anti-government. You need government. Government has to play a part of healthcare. Right. I've spent a lot of time in government trying to work with healthcare. But it is not the government that's solving this problem. It's innovation that's solving it, and it isn't the government that's forcing it. It's economic dispassionate forces that are global. There are global forces that are driving this kind of change, and people are responding to it. And to the degree that government can be a tool, that's great. To the degree that government stands in the way, it's not a good thing.
One you mentioned before, I believe, Mike, you alluded to the fact that in previous industrial revolutions, at the beginning of the 19th century, then arguably at the beginning of the 20th, when people were leaving farms in droves to work in factories and so forth, that it was painful. I'm elaborating on what you alluded to, but it was painful, but we got over it. It worked. Here we are.
I would argue it's not only we got over it, I would argue that it was our ability to transition
Correct.
Those eras more effectively than anybody else in the world
100%.
did, that made it possible for us to continue to prosper. I mean, I often say that we're talking about change here, and you really only have three choices. You can fight it and die, you can accept it and go along and have a chance, or you can lead it and prosper.
Right.
And in all of the significant transitions over the course of the last 150 years, we have led.
Correct.
And I think if you get right to the bottom of it, we are not leading in this one. And the initiative we're focusing on is what are the big gears that we could lead on that would begin to make all the little ones turn, and allow these principles that have allowed us to succeed as a country to continue to have this generation. Every generation of Americans has had to demonstrate that we were worthy to be considered the most powerful economic force on the planet. We are this generation is now having to demonstrate that in a new transition. And so the goal is to help identify the points.
I really think, Kurt, that in times of great disruption, there is great opportunity. And that's really what we need to focus on. That's, as Mike says, we have to find the big gears. That's where we need to put our energy. There is great disruption. Instead of accepting the consequences of it that we're seeing with jobs being disrupted and people being uncertain about how to pursue their lives and people hanging on to the old institutions. The high school was created out of the industrial age to serve the industrial age. Most of our institutions are big centralized institutions that were created out of the industrial age to serve that age. Well, it's been a long time since most Americans have worked for a lifetime for Fortune 500 companies. It's been 10 or 15 years. Most of the job growth has come in small businesses. Most people don't expect to have the same employer their entire career. So it's about time we get on with figuring out how we're going to create this new American dream for what is clearly a global networked age. It is not the industrial age anymore. And the institutions are breaking down, but we're not building the new high schools. We're not focused on how do we really deploy the great tools that are available to us so that they can add up to something very, very important. We're excited about each of them individually, and they're benefiting their founders with great economic success, and they're facilitating a lot of things that individuals or small businesses or businesses of any size couldn't do before. But we still have a tiny fraction of American businesses that view themselves as exporters. And yet there's tremendous possibility for us to grow our businesses and grow good work. These are good jobs potentially, if we really scale up our engagement with the needs of the world. So how do we use technology tools as platforms to help people figure out what those needs are, how what they do fits, people don't even export to another state, let alone, to China. How do we really become part of this global economy in an exciting way?
And are you guys both, it seems as though you are both more optimistic than pessimistic, than that there are those who could say, oh, yeah, meeting the challenges of the last industrial revolutions proved our mettle, made us greater, made us more powerful, absolutely true. But maybe this time is different, and maybe we have reached the end of our American century run. Do you ever have worries in the middle of the night that that's true?
I think it is possible that others will see these opportunities and move on them faster than we do. I think, if you look at, some of the platforms like Odesk, where people are freelancers are selling their particular talents online, a lot of Russians, Ukrainians using those platforms. But I still personally really believe in the American spirit, the American creativity, ingenuity. We have a lot of people in this country who have an awful lot to contribute. And I don't think that the trajectory we're on now is for others to race by us. I think we can bypass a lot of our broken institutions where we have fallen behind other countries to our great chagrin, and we can bypass those institutions with new tools. But we really have to get on this fast. This is happening fast. There is tremendous urgency to address this. And if we don't get on this fast, we could miss out.
I am absolutely certain, as I've suggested, that it is ours to lose. We have rule of law. We have a long tradition of economic vibrance. We are still the capital central of the world. It's very difficult to build a case, I think, against the United States as continuing. However, if you look at history, it's also clear that at certain points, generations, whether it's in family businesses or in countries, ultimately begin to lose their momentum, and you have to shoot it into a new orbit. So I don't think you can be absolutely certain. accept that we can be absolutely certain it's ours to lose.
Yeah.
And I think that's the purpose of this initiative.
Well, and you look back at as doing some research on this, I looked back at the early 19th century Industrial Revolution. And that all seems like it worked out great now, but it was a couple of generations before, there was a stagnation of wages in the 1820s and 30s. It was the 1860s before we had our mojo back. So this is not a thing that's going to happen, if we can use history as a guide, overnight.
It won't, and never has.
Yeah.
And I think that adds to a reason to be optimistic.
Yeah. And if you were suddenly the czar of our country, and okay, the big gears are education and technology. What does that mean? What would you do if you could say, I want this to happen, God, or because I'm the czar? What would those things be? What would those three things be that you do?
Well, I would add regulation to it, because I think we stymie innovation in ways that are artificial.
So the progressive movement as a model of 100 years ago is not your model, because that was all about regulation, right?
Well, the progressive movement was about recognizing there was an imbalance. And any time in a democracy there's an imbalance, you're going to see a pushback, and you're trying to reach balance.
Right.
And so the question is, have we reached the point where we have an imbalance one way or the other? I think you can point the fact that there's a lot of regulation that puts us at a significant disadvantage as a country as we try to operate in a global marketplace and try to generate these jobs and to create the tax revenue that allows us to fuel the education. I think you can make a very good case that regulation is part of the problem.
And there are some regulations that can really help open this up too. So government has a huge amount of data that can be enormously valuable, both for education and for building businesses. And we've begun to open up some of that data to the public. So the GPS system was built off of open data. As Vivek mentioned in the video, the opening up of access to human genome data has been transformative. The Weather Channel and all the other weather apps that we use are built off of government data. There's a tremendous opportunity, if the government perceived that as in the public domain, as owned by the public, there's tremendous opportunity to use that information to build businesses and to build knowledge. I mean, the Climate Corporation uses government data combined with private data to improve the productivity of farmers 20 to 30% by bringing together weather data and soil data and an understanding of a whole variety of the ecosystem that impacts crop growth. And that was a company that was built as an independent company off of government data and was sold last year to Monsanto for $1 billion. So the possibilities of the government to use its regulatory power to feed this system that we see of learning different ways and of growing businesses in different ways is really tremendous. And the government's now made Medicare data open in a way that hasn't been before. That may be very useful. But there's so much more that could be done by the government thinking about itself as serving a system like this and using the regulatory power to enable those 1,000 flowers to bloom, to enable American amateurism, as you call it, or entrepreneurship, or pluck to build without the government having to run the program or fund the program.
Right. Regarding those as common assets rather than...
Right.
Time for some questions from the audience for either... Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm Michael Conniff. I am head of the Digital Story Lab at the Isaacson School for New Media. And I wanted to suggest that and get your comments on a really big gear could be social media. And maybe not as most people think of it, but social media meaning community, meaning if the power of the community behind a business or an idea. And I hear you talking in a very interesting way about technology and education. I have not heard any indication about how the most important development in media and in communication and in technology is probably social media. So is that a big year, and do you have the language to really embrace that?
It's absolutely important, and you know, again, we all need great language. I mean, for example, Salesforce has created a social media platform for small businesses to do data analytics together, so that they don't each have to invest in the analytic capacity and can draw on each other. And there are a million ways, examples we could give of the importance of social media. When I talk about technology, I'm really thinking about the access to sharing information and to engaging with each other, and I don't really mean just the tools of technology themselves, but thank you for that. That's a really important addition.
I would underscore by saying I think that social media it may well begin to transform the way our political system works. The transition of parties. I'm in the Republican Party. I see what's happened in our party, and we've got a very small group of people in many states who have been have used a system to essentially keep the decisions on who is elected to very small groups of people. With social media, that begins to. That's not the way people process information these days. And therefore, social media, I think, is going to open that up and can begin to inject a lot of these new ideas. We may begin to see an entirely different kind of person elected as leaders as a result of that through entirely different processes.
And social media is also very exciting in terms of who are the teachers. People can teach each other, and we need, again, to find ways to certify those skills that are learned through social media and to honor them and respect them and to deploy them. And there's some of this happening already as businesses are looking for new ways to figure out whether someone is a qualified employee. So I think every institution, as Mike points out, from the most staid to the most innovative, I think every institution is going to be impacted and potentially constructively from social media.
And to the degree we need models in each of these realms to become the model that then other people can emulate. Of course, I mean, the Kickstarter crowdfunding model already has a name. I mean, Kickstarter has practically become generic. And as a way to use social media, it's
I don't mean to keep bringing this back to the education discussion, but on this university, I talked about it earlier, Western Governors University, many of the students now are exchanging different ways in which they have learned, and because they measure whether a person's learned it and not where they learned it, social media has become a huge part of the way students are beginning to both teach each other and to reward different learning modalities by pointing out their success with it.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you for this very stimulating conversation. You're talking about online education, but there's also something else that last year we really became aware of, and that was city colleges. We had the privilege here to listen to the chancellor from Miami talking about his city colleges. This year, Mayor Rahm Emanuel of Chicago decided that our city colleges should provide a better education for the middle-class child that needs to stay at home and maybe work part-time, but to live at home. And so he decided that out of the city colleges, that they were going to be focused. And so he decided, for instance, where I'm involved, I'm chairman of the board of governors of Rush University Medical College in Chicago, and BMO Harris gave us a nice grant to do this, so that he took the City College Malcolm X and decided to focus it for entry-level medical things, so that we would have technicians and we would do licensed practical nurses and other medical and health care. I think it offers our students a wonderful way to interact with professors. I mean, I know online has a purpose. My DNP program, my Doctor of Nurse Practitioners program, is an online course because these people are working. But to motivate young people, we're very successful. And I just wanted you just sort of to discuss this as another option.
It sounds like a great option. And again, I would argue that what inhibits us isn't just how we deliver it, it's what we measure and value, and that if the program if programs like this can begin to say, we're going to, a program that you have described may well be a far superior learning model than an Ivy League university who is stuck in the old way. And if you're measuring, if you could ultimately say, let's measure how well students learn in the program you've described as against we'd probably begin to reward it in far different ways. Maybe some of the alumni at these large institutions would reward what you've described as opposed to the tradition.
I'm going to echo the thanks. My name is Tom Connolly. I'm one of the global leaders from Ernst & Young, which we now call EY. And the question that I wanted to pose to you is really about communication and reach and creating momentum. And to that, most of the issues that we talk about to the broader population, particularly around election time, they're single issues, or they're presented as single issues. And I think that creates a sense of apathy, a sense of resistance, and it doesn't bring people together. So to your point about the interlocking gears, what's the platform? What can we do in terms of a platform that creates, if you will, a broader understanding amongst the population of the things that you're talking about and how a single initiative that's being talked about has such deep ramifications to all of the other issues, and therefore give people that sense of, by doing one thing, I impact many things?
I think we have to identify the big gears and talk about them, because
It's a wonderful comment, and it's something that I think about every day. It's very hard, particularly with all the nasty and negative noise in the American dialogue, to have people talk about challenges and even opportunities. And one of the main reasons we're having this conversation here is that there's so many interesting, bright minds in this community, and we hope that people will be thinking about and coming up with ideas to address just that. I mean, we'll do everything we can with the people who have been part of our group, and people from Howard Schultz to Madeleine Albright to Mike Levitt are able to get a lot of attention to things. But this really is something, as you identify, that needs to be owned by the American people. People need to see themselves in it. And so we need to begin to much more effectively get out the examples of what's working, the models, as Kurt says, so that people can replicate those models, but then also really energize the platforms that can help people see themselves in this future and go for it and explain to their parents why they're doing it. And you know, it was really interesting watching the kids who worked for Starbucks when they first heard about this benefit that was going to be offered to them, explaining to their parents that they were going to go back to college online. And at first the parents were in tears because their employer was going to help them go back to college. And then they had all these questions, you know, what is an online degree? You know, what is Arizona State University? I live in Portland. You know, there's a lot of conversation we need to have, but what we're hoping is that people will get excited about talking about things that can actually help move us forward, and quit beating up on each other, or let's ignore the people who are beating up on each other. You know, you ask about the political system, let's just go do it. And let's ignore the people who are talking about the wrong things or the singular issues or dragging America down.
I just finished reading a book I recommended to Zoe yesterday called Switch. Maybe you've read it. It's subtitled is something like How to Bring Change When Change is Hard. And as I read it, the big message is just get started. Once you get started, things happen. Big things always start with small things. And so just turning the big gear a little bit in some way, it catches on because we have social media and there's lots of ways in which these people are hungry for good things. And so it's part of my optimism.
Yeah, but I think to that point, you need a name. I mean, libertarianism, liberalism, progressivism, conservatism, neoconservatism, whatever those mean, and they mean different things to different people, they have a name that people sense, oh, I get what that is.
So what we want to do is, there are great journalists in this room. We want you to get together in the corner after this meeting and please tell us what the name is. And then we want you to go back to E&Y and say, you guys are all over the country. So what can you do in your communities that can start this conversation? You know, you're absolutely right, but help us.
Zoe Baird, Mike Levitt, all of you, thanks very much.
Thank you very much.